Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Avila, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Policy at Children's Aid. On behalf of the Fostering Youth Success Alliance, we thank you for joining us this morning. Today's presentation is the third in a series of 4 webinars focused on understanding and addressing the priority needs of New York's foster youth in the aftermath of the COVID-19 health crisis. During each webinar, we will share findings from a pandemic impact survey of New York's older youth from foster care. We also spotlight priorities and policy recommendations that address both pre- and post-pandemic issues of concern for young people with a foster care background across the state. Our goal is to improve their stability and expand support to ensure every young person from foster care is ready to move forward in a positive direction. To give context to the survey findings, FYSA has prepared a report entitled Moving Forward, a Post-Pandemic Blueprint for New York's Foster Youth. The report link will be in the chat box. Please bookmark this link as we will be adding new content to the report prior to each scheduled webinar. And before we begin, we would like to recognize a few individuals and organizations that have made this effort possible. We'd like to recognize the Children's Aid Office of Performance Management, CAFCA, the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy for developing the New York State Foster Youth COVID-19 Impact Survey. We especially want to acknowledge the 209 young people who responded to our survey. We know that so many foster youth showed tremendous courage and resilience during this challenging time. We also know we have to do more to give each of them the stabilizing supports they need to survive and thrive. Finally, I'd like to thank the many FYSA partners and youth advocates who helped identify key educational priorities and recommendations, which we will share with you today. We'll do some quick housekeeping tips. Everyone is in listen-only mode. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. We will monitor questions and address them at the end of this presentation. The presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the FYSA website. So today we're focusing on education issues for New York's foster youth. We all recognize the unprecedented challenges students, teachers, school administrators, and parents faced due to the switch to distance learning, especially during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also saw how a global health crisis exacerbated a well-known academic achievement gap for foster youth at both the K-12 and post-secondary levels. Now let's look at our agenda. We will provide some background about FYSA, give you an overview of the Moving Forward report, and share study findings and foster youth reflections about their experiences during the pandemic. Then we will talk about how to address the educational barriers facing young people with a foster care background before answering some of your questions. We have a few issue experts with us today who will talk about the educational priorities and recommendations featured in the report. And so that'll be our agenda for today. A little bit about FYSA. The Fostering Youth Success Alliance, or FYSA, launched in 2014. Housed at Children's Aid, FYSA promotes responsive policies and programs that offer young people with a foster care background every opportunity to set higher expectations and achieve their goals. We do this by collaborating and partnering with city and state agencies, advocates, and stakeholders directly impacted by the foster care system, including foster youth, parents, and caretakers to address system reform. We focus on our policy and advocacy work on the socioeconomic issues that impact youth with a foster care background, including K through 12 education, higher education, housing, and health. Our signature initiative is the Foster Youth College Success Initiative, which is administered by the New York State Department of Education. And to date, $34 million has been invested into the initiative. Since launching in 2015, FYSA, as we call it, has served over 2,000 students with a foster care background at 100 public and private colleges and universities in New York State. FYSA also provides opportunities to support foster youth empowerment and the development of advocacy skills through several programs and events, as you see on the slide. And so now we would like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the newest members of the FYSA team. First, we have our new director, Deidre Nesbeth. She is an outstanding child welfare and youth development professional dedicated to amplifying the voices of young people. Previously, she was the inaugural Fair Futures Youth Coach Supervisor at JCCA, supporting foster care involved youth ages 14 and up. Deidre entered the child welfare field as a member of the Children's Corps, where she continues to mentor incoming child welfare professionals. And while at JCCA, Deidre led advocacy and racial equity initiatives and served as a youth development coordinator and case planner. Deidre earned a BA from Dartmouth College, where she designed a course of study to understand the intersectionality of various identities and oppressions. She also holds a Master of Science in Nonprofit Management from Northeastern University. Next, we are joined by Policy and Advocacy Associate Chelsea Rose. She is a graduate of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where she majored in both political science and law and society. Chelsea is passionate about ensuring the right voices are being promoted at every level of policy and advocacy work. Most recently, Chelsea played an integral role in launching the new supportive housing database, CAPS. This work gave her an in-depth knowledge of the New York City housing landscape. We feel very fortunate to have Deidre and Chelsea on board to support the next phase of FYSA's statewide advocacy and outreach efforts focused on improving outcomes for youth in care. Now I'll hand it over to Deidre, who will take us through the COVID impact study.
Thanks, Michelle. So we're going to take a second and we're going to go through this report. So first, let's take a look at how the New York Foster Youth COVID-19 Impact Study was structured. We based our survey on a national study conducted by Foster Club during the early stages of the pandemic in March 2020. We wanted to follow up about a year later to see how the public health crisis was affecting New York's older foster youth, including young adults that have transitioned from the system. Our study questions were very similar to the national survey, with some modifications to reflect the context in New York State. Our targeted age group was young people ages 18 to 26. We distributed the survey through both upstate and downstate partners, and were able to collect responses from 209 young people. Similar to the Foster Club study, we asked foster youth about issues and concerns related to living through a major public health crisis. Please refer to the study background section of the report for demographics and additional information about the survey respondent. This link is in the chat box. So now let's take a look inside the report. Let's take a look at how the report is organized. So on the screen right now, you'll see our table of contents. Right now, we're in a policy brief about education, but there's also information about housing and healthcare. Before that, we have the summary and a study background and information about FYSA. So these three policy briefs feature key findings and address specific and significant pre- and post-pandemic issues related to those issues of housing, education, and healthcare for our state's foster youth. Each policy brief will be released as part of our Moving Forward webinar series All webinars are recorded and are available on the FYSA website. We encourage you to register for the healthcare webinar and share this information with your staff, stakeholders, colleagues. Now, on to the education policy brief. As you can see on the screen before we get started, our healthcare policy brief is coming up on October 28th. So now on to the education policy brief, and a reminder to please use the Q&A box instead of the chat box to submit your questions. So an introduction to the policy brief. While the pandemic definitely caused major disruptions in academic circles as advocates for foster youth, we know there have been long-standing challenges and unique factors that affect educational attainment for this specific student population. Let's take a look at the findings from the New York State Foster Youth COVID-19 Impact Study related to education. So here we see one of our first key findings. So what happens when learning moves from the classroom to a computer screen? Although remote learning was highly disruptive for some students, 84% of survey respondents said they had the tools they needed to do their schoolwork online. Students living alone were twice as likely to report issues related to a lack of an equipment, such as lack of a laptop or computer or Wi-Fi access, than their peers who were living in foster homes. Next, we had a question of how has your education been affected by remote access? So here you'll see that 48% said that they had internet or Wi-Fi access that they needed in order to complete their remote learning. 7% did not have the access to internet or Wi-Fi that was needed to promote their remote learning. 36% had the laptop or computer, whatever devices they needed to do schoolwork, and 10% stated that they did not have laptop, computers, or the devices they needed to do their schoolwork. So who is most affected? So we took a look and we saw that 20% of the survey respondents ranked educational support as their biggest concern for the next 6 months. Before the pandemic, 49% of survey respondents were in post-secondary education and 22% were in high school. 77% of foster youth previously enrolled in school continued their studies during the pandemic. And to the question of who was most affected, we just bookmarked that our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, youth from NYC, and former foster youth living independently, they were some of the most impacted groups according to our survey responses. For the question of how did COVID-19 impact your education, the survey responses showed that 63% of the youth answering continued school online or partially online and in person. 5% had to stop attending because school was canceled. 14% continued school with no change whatsoever, and 17% stopped attending for other reasons not related to school being canceled. So, while many students from foster care showed remarkable resilience during the lockdown, undereducated youth will continue to face a rocky road after COVID-19 subsides. Without intervention, we know there'll be long-term consequences if foster youth fail to receive a quality education that allows them to compete for jobs and succeed as independent young adults. So here we see that of the 89 college students who took the survey, 83% were actively participating in an academic program during the pandemic. We have further breakdowns of what those different programs were highlighted here on this slide. So here, we're able to see some reflections from young people of how did COVID-19 affect your education. These are reflections directly from youth. So some stated they were unable to finish school, Another stated, I lost TAP and Pell due to my loss of financial aid because doing online classes through COVID was a huge struggle. Another stated, I desperately needed in-person math tutoring last semester. Another, I needed support with my tuition fees. I'm not eligible to apply for grants because I'm not yet documented. Some other remarks from young people. There are issues accessing and getting financial support in a timely manner due to COVID and being a foster youth. I wish it was easier. This last semester was a complete fluke. I had to withdraw medically for my mental health because this semester just made me so sad. For college, online learning was not effective for me. I need face-to-face. So again, these are just some reflections directly from young people that they shared about how COVID-19 impacted their ability to learn during the pandemic. So now I'll hand it over to Yolanda to take us through our priorities and recommendations.
Thank you, Deidre, and good morning, everyone. I'm Yolanda McBride, Director of Public Policy at Children's Aid. Now we're going to review the education policy priorities and recommendations from the Moving Forward Blueprint. We addressed both K-12 education and college post-secondary education programs. A reminder that you can review the report by clicking the link in the chat box. Priorities and recommendations. Ensure educational attainment and stability for students from foster care of all ages. Give students the access and ability to receive a high quality education under all circumstances, in the least restrictive environments, and with necessary support. Offer trauma-informed training and education advocacy, guidance to help faculty, administrators, guidance counselors, and other school staff better understand and serve youth from foster care. Prepare all children for higher education, including providing information that helps them maximize their academic and economic potential. Share available post-secondary options such as college, trade schools, and career training programs. Encourage K-12 educators and administrators to understand the stigma often associated with being in foster care and how this may hinder self-identification by youth attending their schools. Next recommendation is around resolving the digital divide and other remote learning issues for K-12 students in foster care. This was something that we were actually seeing a lot of during the pandemic and still are experiencing. Ensure policymakers understand that students in foster care lacked equipment, Wi-Fi access, and data plans long before the pandemic shifted schools to online learning. Other factors such as household structure stability can limit access to the tools, support, and environment students need to focus and succeed academically. Minimize tech-related learning disruptions by giving every student in care their own data-enabled device. This low-cost solution is preferable for students versus loaned equipment because youth in care sometimes lose equipment and internet access when they move to different homes or schools. Continuing the recommendations around the digital divide and other remote learning issues, expedite the distribution of technology devices to New York City students by giving process oversight to the Administration for Children's Services, ACS, instead of the Department of Education. ACS knows where K-12 students are in foster care and their locations. Similarly, process oversight for youth in care upstate should be handled by the County Division of Social Services in collaboration with each county's Department of Education. Support online learning by increasing technical support, IT, hotline, video tutorials for older foster youth and foster parents caring for younger students. Develop strategies to reverse pre and post-pandemic learning loss for K-12 students in foster care, strengthen relationships between child welfare agencies and statewide departments of education to prepare students for the return to in-person education, continue to monitor school bus capacity and close transportation gaps to help students in foster care stay at their schools of origin, train and deploy peer advisors to offer middle and high school students in foster care emotional support, admissions assistance, and more exposure to college and career options. Promote and replicate effective college readiness models for youth in foster care. Share information about the statewide Foster Youth College Success Initiative, FYSA, educational opportunity programs, and other college prep resources with middle school and high school educators, administrators, guidance counselors, and students. Host workshops to review program eligibility, application processes, and deadlines. Promote the Making College Success a Reality for New York's Youth and Care Resource Guide and webinar series to high school guidance counselors and academic advisors working with graduating seniors to navigate college enrollment and financial aid. Expand effective college prep programs such as summer boot camp orientations designed to support students from foster care as they make the transition from high school to college. Next, commit to timely data sharing to help child welfare education specialists prepare K-12 foster youth for college. Work with government partners to open access to academic data for tracking student progress and tailoring support for youth in foster care. Next recommendation is around collaborating with family court judges and legal advocates to make educational attainment a priority focus for youth in foster care. Identify information gaps, intervention strategies, and oversight opportunities to improve monitoring and education milestones beyond student attendance. So before we present the priorities and recommendations for college and post-secondary programs, we actually have two special guests here today to share their perspectives related to FYSA's K-12 recommendations. Please note that the data represents a point in time, and although the survey focused on youth ages 18 to 26, the working group on education comprised of youth with the foster care background and foster care advocates and agencies thought it really important to have K-12 recommendations lifted up as part of this report, along with recommendations on higher education. So first, I'm going to call up Dr. Brenda Triplett, who is the Director of Educational Achievement and Partnerships at Children's Aid. Dr. Triplett?
Yeah, thank you, Yolanda. Good morning, everyone. As Yolanda said, I am the director. My background, 35 years as a public school administrator, teacher, building leader, and retired, and now serving as a director for educational achievement for foster youth in New York City at Children's Aid. You know, I just want to start. I'm so glad that this report is covering K through 12 and not just the far end, because we know how important it is, early intervention. And the problems just don't appear in high school or when they get to college. The problems start with the quality of education in elementary and preschool. I just want to put out just a quick statistics, right? 34% of youth in foster care, they will change schools between 5 and 6 times while in the system. That is incredible. You know, the system was designed, and I didn't realize this when I was an administrator in schools. There's so much that I didn't know as a school administrator. I wish I had known. I would have been better. I would have been more sensitive. I would have made sure that my teachers and my staff were aware of the rights and the needs and challenges of youth and their families in foster care. Again, the main goal is reunification of families. So every time a child changes a foster home, many times schools were changed as well. There are mandates that are in place to avoid that. But the other statistic I want to throw out is that, youth in foster care in New York City, they're scattered among the 32 school districts. So many times we hear from our young people that they almost feel invisible. Speaking as a prior educator in public school, many times there are only a handful, there might be a handful of youth in your schools that are in foster care. And sometimes they go under the radar. They're not considered like one of the subgroups in which academic data is reported out on, like English language learners, or or those youth who fall under the special education umbrella. Youth in foster care, although it is recommended, it's required that they do report out on this subgroup. It's not something that you can just press a button and there it appears. You have to really search. And so what's sometimes not measured kind of goes under the radar and it doesn't get as much attention. There is no doubt that there is disproportionality among poor children and children of color and in the foster care system. And that's just a fact. We know that close to 50% of our youth, they have IEPs. This absolutely is an indication of the disproportionality. We know that trauma impacts children in multiple ways. We know that the number of suspensions are not due to just defiance or behavioral issues related to special education. Their trauma is a time traveler, and we need people in the school who understand the history of youth in foster care and how to best service them. So 20% will go on to college, 3% will graduate. As many as 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have spent some time in the child welfare system. Just let that sink in for a minute. I just want to now flip the script, and I want to look through an asset lens. We know what the liability is. We know that being in foster care, we know the downside, but you know what? There is a positive. There is a flip side to that. If we are all proactive and if we recognize the needs and where the gaps are, and we work together to try to pass policies and practices that will mitigate the impact of being in foster care and changing homes and changing schools. So I want to talk about the FYSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, right? This is a mandate that states that schools and child welfare organizations must use their due diligence to ensure that youth in care remain in their schools of origin. That means that if a child is placed in a foster home in the Bronx and they had been attending school in Manhattan prior to being removed from their home, they have a right to still go to that same school in Manhattan for a multitude of reasons. You know this. Consistency, it's where their teachers are, their community, their friends. And so when their lives have been turned upside down, the least we can do is try to keep them in their schools of origin. Of course, if there's an order of protection, if there's safety issues, and I mean, it's case by case, but that's the overall goal. And I am telling you that as a over 30-year school administrator, I didn't know this. I didn't know that it was my responsibility to make sure that I connected with the child welfare agency and worked together to try to make sure that that child could remain in my school. Then, of course, comes the issue of transportation. Now, this is something that a lot of the advocacy groups, they are strongly advocating that more money be placed specifically for the purpose of helping to enforce FYSA. How do we keep children in their schools of origin? How do we get children from the Bronx to their school in Manhattan if there's no transportation? So the current policy is if a child is in grades K through 6, and they qualify based on distance for transportation normally, then DOE will take care of that. Or if they're in 7th and 8th grade with an IEP and transportation on that IEP, then they will get service. They'll get transportation. But what about that? What about that 8th grader? What about that 7th grader without an IEP who isn't mature enough yet to travel from Brooklyn Heights to the Heights in Manhattan, or the student who was placed in Yonkers, and their school is in the Bronx, and they're in their senior year. So we know that we need to advocate. We need to put money where we need to match practice and policy. Just want to talk about COVID, the impact of COVID. Our college students and our teens, they experienced the most dramatic impact. The mental health issues were abundant. Our high school students, suicide ideations were up. You know how difficult it is to get students from high school to college. To get them to sustain in college takes even more energy. COVID made it very difficult for even our most prized, our brightest, most motivated college students to remain there. They found virtual learning to be difficult, and many of our children, many of the students had tutors, but the virtual tutoring was also a challenge. Our college students who actually considered the college campus as their home, those who were in the dorm project, it was formerly known as a dorm project, and the beauty behind that was that they didn't have to pack up their things around Christmas time or springtime to go back home. The program allowed them to remain on campus all year. This became the home for many of our college students who were in foster care. And COVID, they were given 1 week notice as many times to vacate, and they were homeless again. And trying to find a home for a 20-year-old was very, very difficult and so challenging for them. So we need professional development in schools. We need to make sure that all of the people who have a hand in educationally in preparing youth in foster care to become productive citizens and well prepared for independence, they have to understand the rights. They have to understand what's out there. Just one last point, the importance of guidance counselors in high schools. We know that the Regents exam requirement, it's difficult for many students, foster care or not. And there are alternate pathways to graduation. So we find that a lot of our youth, they're undercredited, overaged, or they have no or few Regents exams under their belts, and we know that they have to pass the 5 Regents exams to graduate. Well, there are alternate pathways. There are alternate pathways like performance-based assessments or superintendent's appeals or safety nets. And if folks in schools, guidance counselors don't know this, that there is a way to help our children to succeed in graduating so they can take advantage of those opportunities that are offered for youth in college. To go to college, who were once in foster care, we're really doing our students a grave disservice. And I know from experience, sitting in a guidance counselor's office and asking that they consider one of the superintendent's appeals or a safety net to get the student out, they were perplexed, and they would ask me, can you send me information? Can you tell me where I can find information? So there is definitely an information gap, but we all have to be on the same page in order to adequately meet the needs of our youth in care, educationally, socially, and emotionally. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Triplett. Really appreciate your remarks and the perspective that you're bringing as a former administrator, now working on the child welfare side to support youth in care in terms of their educational attainment. And also appreciate you kind of previewing some of the concerns and also a little bit of the recommendations you will see around the post-secondary and higher education recommendations that we have that Deidre will talk a little bit more about. Next, we would like to call up Ron Richter, who is the CEO of JCCA, and who is also a former family court judge, who will talk a little bit about the family court judge system and his experiences with foster care and education.
I don't know if everyone can hear me, but I am here. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me and for facilitating a program on this critical topic. So let me start by saying that there is a great opportunity for advocacy around education in our family court. And the key word here, I think, is partnership. And obviously, when you introduce the family court into education advocacy for young people in foster care, the critical nature of communicating about the specific needs of young people becomes paramount. And it is very important, I think, to identify that there are caseworkers, obviously from agencies in family court, that need to understand young people's needs. There are also parents of young people in foster care and foster parents involved, and there are lots of lawyers. And so the nature of family court requires that people get advance notice of any information that may be brought to the court. And often, as a judge, situations result in delay when anyone comes to the court and makes applications for certain services. And there are people who don't know in advance that those applications are going to be made. So whenever we talk about the family court, it is important to understand that the judge needs people to know what's going to happen in advance, because part of a judge's responsibility is to give people the opportunity to think about what the judge may order and be heard, have an opportunity to say, if you're a parent, well, gosh, I didn't know that they were thinking about putting my kid in a particular class or putting my kid in a particular place academically. I need to talk to my child about that. I need to talk to my lawyer about that. And so it's a reason that may cause delay. So I would just say that whenever we're talking about the family court, thinking in advance about what you may want to do or ask the court to do is very important. I would also put everyone on notice that the family court does not have jurisdiction over the state education department or the city's Department of Education. So no jurisdiction over DOE or SED in the family court. It is really important to understand that as a family court judge, I could not implead the Department of Education. Lots of times lawyers come in and they want the judge to order DOE around. Can you make DOE do this? Can you make DOE do that? Under the law in New York, and there's a lot of reasons for this, I as a judge could not. That was very frustrating for me, because surely I would like to order safety transfers in lots of cases. I am not empowered under the law as a family court judge to do that. You should all know that. In fact, I can't make DOE do anything as a family court judge. That may be something that legislatively we all want to work on, but currently that is a fact. So keep that in mind. I think it's really important, therefore, to think about our work as partnership. And to keep in mind that family court judges often are not as well versed in the unique needs of the individual children that come before them. And as you all know, in family court, volume is always a challenge for the judge. So to the extent that caseworkers, lawyers come into the court prepared with information, prepared to paint a picture of a young person's education needs and other needs with documentary evidence, with evaluations that can be handed up, that can be described, always having provided other counsel with copies in advance, really makes a difference to the judge. So that I understand as a family court judge what is different about this young person and why I may want to make orders relevant to those needs. You know, I'm always amazed that we think of children in care often as having deficits in learning, when often they have strengths in learning, and it is really useful for a judge to understand both. We all learn differently, and we all have unique needs. And so it is important to think when you're going before a judge in terms of what makes the most sense for that young person. Because a judge has to make decisions often about, you know, what is in the best interests of that child. So, for example, the education of a young person can be very relevant to the removal of a child. Often you'll hear a removal application, and as part of that application, no one talks about how the child's doing in school. So you'll have a 6 or 7-year-old and the agency is seeking a removal, and the judge may ask, how's the kid doing in school? And sometimes you'll hear, oh, the child's performing wonderfully in school, often from the parent's lawyer. The kid's doing great. And that affects the judge, because if there's imminent risk, if this child needs to be removed, how is it that the child's doing so well in school? And pursue that. On the other hand, if this child's never been to school, and there's demonstrated evidence the child's never been to school, that raises questions for you as well. So all this to say that school involvement, school performance are really important to a family court judge. That means IEP information is critical, and as I said before, evaluations. For those of you who don't know, there are family courts that have DOE liaisons stationed in the court, and those can often be very helpful resources. Because there are limitations on the jurisdiction of the family court, you will often find as agencies that judges order agencies like JCCA to do a lot related to the child's education plan. And this is where partnership comes in. So it is important that, especially around permanency for a child, we figure out how to work with the lawyers in family court around permanency hearings to figure out how to ensure that we're doing everything we can and that orders in the family court don't end up being punitive for agencies, but in fact end up being supportive to young people. I think that if we plan in advance, having young people appear before judges that can be really nurturing and supportive can be very helpful for foster youth. And that we should encourage judges to support young people, because sometimes judges can be terrifically helpful in encouraging young people to pursue education and to succeed. So I would just end by saying that it is important for our kids in care to identify metrics beyond grades and attendance that can help us track progress, identify strengths, measure success. So a young person's participation in supportive programs like tutoring, extracurricular activities and sports, mentoring, coaching, all these things I think for most judges matter and can sometimes distract a judge from what are the traditional metrics of success. So I hope all of this is helpful. And I hope that you all will sincerely consider the recommendations that that have been presented. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Ron. We really appreciate your insight from your experience as a judge and now working at a child welfare agency. We're going to jump in to some of the recommendations and priorities that we saw for college and post-secondary programs based off of the survey responses. So this first one that we have right up here is to remove barriers to higher education success for youth in care. We want to increase enrollment and support persistence to ensure young people from foster care earn their degrees or vocational and trade certifications. Treat students from foster care with dignity and respect. Empower the student voice and agency in policymaking and implementation plans. Share information about available resources directly with students, and continue to advocate for the sustainability and expansion of the statewide Foster Youth College Success Initiative to keep pace with growth and the provision of new student cohorts. Our next recommendation is to improve student identification to give youth from foster care every opportunity to benefit from programs and resources that support their educational goals. Streamline the youth consent process to make it easier for students to self-identify, such as offering a secure online form. Explore how to address student name changes, for instance with orphans, on consent forms and in financial aid applications. Improve student identification for the statewide Foster Youth College Success Initiative to give youth from foster care every opportunity to benefit from programs and resources that support their educational goals. Here you'll see our next recommendation is to designate and support foster youth campus liaisons to promote accountability, support matriculation, and improve educational outcomes for college students from foster care. To do this, we recommend coordinating services similar to a concierge to ensure students with a foster care background receive helpful assistance from each department they encounter on their college campuses. Also establishing a team of campus liaisons rather than assigning one person to identify students from foster care and provide ongoing support throughout the academic year. Encouraging liaisons to then share information about the statewide Foster Youth College Success Initiative and other academic support programs. Issue reminders to students about applications and program deadlines. Continuing on that recommendation, we also recommend sharing student identification strategies with campus liaisons and providing lists of eligible foster youth on campus. Creating sample job descriptions, outreach activity checklists, and other tools to help liaisons support students from foster care. Convene a virtual meeting of current campus liaisons from public and private colleges to collect and document best practices and lessons learned from working with youth care. Lastly, determine how to support students from foster care at schools that currently do not have campus liaisons to ensure all youth with a foster care background can succeed in their post-secondary goals. Our next recommendation is to prepare for potential school disruptions by making social distance learning easier for students from foster care. This would include securing and distributing necessary equipment and supplies, such as computers, laptops, Wi-Fi hotspots, printers, ink, to help students continue their studies online. Also offering online tutoring, advising, and wellness checks to college students living away from campus due to unexpected shutdowns. Also collaborating with youth advocates, case planners, and education specialists at child welfare agencies to identify future remote learning needs for students. Replicating and expanding peer-to-peer learning support models, including online tutoring, virtual study groups, student help forums, and group chat sessions. So this recommendation is to track academic outcomes and students enrolled in the statewide Foster Youth College Success Initiative. This looks like developing a plan for collecting and analyzing data related to college enrollment, persistence, and graduation rates since the program's inception, and also sharing examples of student success, including how FYSA made a positive difference for students during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here you'll see that the last page for the education policy brief features additional resources to help support the education of foster youth, including the Making College Success resource guide. When you are in the report, you can click on each listing to get more information. The link for this report is in the chat. So the different resources that we have access to are the Making College Success a Reality Guide, this webinar on Foster Youth College Success Initiative. This occurs each year. Q&As and FAQs, a webinar on distance learning policy recommendations, and a distance learning tip sheet for advocates. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. We'll try to answer any questions that we have. Next, Chelsea will share a brief evaluation poll before we get to those questions.
Okay, while we get ready to answer your questions, we ask you to please fill out the poll questions that just popped up on your screen. This will help us by evaluating our presentation today.
Great. So now we will take a few questions that have come in through the chat box. So there's one question. Are there programs for older youth over 21 to have the option of dorming since it wasn't available due to COVID when it first came around?
I can take that question, Michelle. I think it depends on where you are attending school. I know that SUNY has a policy of supporting young people that are attending school to make sure that they have year-round housing, specifically for youth with a foster care background. You have to identify yourself to the school to let them know that you qualify for this. And CUNY, if you are referring to the CUNY Foster College Success Program, that's the city's program. There are still opportunities. I would just ask if you can please connect with us offline at FYSA at children'saidnyc.org, and we can connect you to the appropriate person.
Thank you, Yolanda. So next question. Will foster youth still receive help when they are 21 but still in college?
I can also take this question. Yes. And again, it depends on the school that you're attending and your agency. And again, this is another question that because of the particular, the specific information that we would need to get in order to determine what the accurate answer is, I'm going to also ask you to connect with myself at the same email that I'm about to put in the chat so that we can make sure you have the right information.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. There's another question. Many of the resources provided are based in New York City. Can we get information regarding developing resources in upstate New York, such as housing for foster youth when they age out?
I can answer this question. So one of our briefs is also on housing, and we are actually working right now to make sure we're developing resources and finding out more resources to share. You can find access to the housing webinar on our website, and we are also happy to share resources as we continue to create them.
Thanks so much, Deidre. Looks like our last question is a more technical one. Is there an alternative way to access the full education brief? It seems like they're having some trouble accessing the link. And you can get the brief on the FYSA website, and we will put the link in the chat.
If there are no other questions, I just want to thank you all for just showing up today and attending today's webinar on education. And just a quick reminder to please save the date for our next webinar on October 28th, which is focused on health. You can also register for or watch all of the Moving Forward webinars on the FYSA website, and the link to that will be in the chat. A recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the FYSA website for future reference. And we encourage you to read the full post-pandemic blueprint to support young people from foster care across the state. Again, many thanks again for attending today's session. If you have any additional questions for us, please contact us at FYSA@children'saidnyc.org. That email is in the chat. And we hope that you have a really great day and rest of the week. Oh, I'm sorry, I think there is, Kaori, you said you don't know if your question got answered. Yes, Kaori, I put in the email, in the chat, my email address. If you can please reach out to us at that email address and we can connect you to the right individuals that can support you on your questions. It's a little bit more nuanced and we just need a little bit more information to make sure that we're giving you the right information and also directing you to the right people that can support you. You're welcome. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day and an amazing week.